The early 2000s saw a bit of a change in the direction with PC first-person shooters. Up until this point in time, most of the marquee titles took place in an entirely fictional universe, without any real grounding to history. Like, I don't exactly remember the great Hell on Earth incident in the early 90s, you know what I mean? Now, there were some exceptions of course. id Software's Wolfenstein 3D comes to mind, but while that had a story based on a loosely historic period of time, that's kind of where it ended. But 10 years later, the PC would get another entry in a similar time period. Alas, this entry would feel a lot more grounded in history, somewhat shockingly so at times. That game is obviously Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Now, many games during this time period, the early 2000s, revisited these historic real-world conflicts and were armed with much greater graphical fidelity and new gameplay mechanics. A lot of these games went on to sell millions of copies, and some of them are still selling millions of copies today. Game-wise, there was Call of Duty, Viet Cong, Battlefield 1942, and of course Medal of Honor Allied Assault, just to name a few. But today we're going to look at the game that I'll argue started the trend, and that's Medal of Honor Allied Assault. Now, for those of you proficient in video game history, you'll know that Allied Assault was not the first entry into the Medal of Honor series, despite it being the first entry on PC. No, Medal of Honor actually originated on the humble PlayStation in 1999, simply titled Medal of Honor. Then a year later, Medal of Honor Underground was released, again for PlayStation. Both titles released to favourable reviews. There was also a Game Boy Advance port of Underground, and yes, it was as bad as it sounds. Now, in 2002, we got the PC entry into the franchise, Allied Assault, which released to overwhelmingly positive reviews. We also got 2 expansions for this, which unsurprisingly also released to positive reviews. But for today's retrospective, we are going to be focusing on the base game. And what a base game it is. This was probably one of the first video games I ever played where the lines between being a movie experience and a game experience seemed to blur. From the immersive briefing room used for the main menu to the expertly narrated mission briefings, the game pulls you into the universe before you even take control. Heck, even the box art depicting the D-Day landing pulls you into the game before you've even inserted the CD into your drive. Now, I don't believe for a moment this game is perfect, and I think there are some really annoying mechanics, more on this later, that hold it back from being a masterpiece, but without a doubt, it's a thoroughly enjoyable game that even in 2023 is still mostly fun to play. Mostly. Before we continue, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you enjoy this content, or if you just want to show me some thanks for spending hours getting the widescreen version of this game to work on my Windows 11 PC, please do consider subscribing. It helps support the channel, and you can be notified of new content the moment it drops. With that out of the way, let's pick up our Thompson submachine gun, chug a first aid flask, and head back to 2002 to remember Medal of Honor Allied Assault. As I mentioned, before you even start the first mission of the game, it does a bang-on job of pulling you into its World War II universe. From what I can tell, again, bear with my public education here, all of the missions in the game are mostly grounded in historic accuracy. For example, the first mission sees you making your way to a lighthouse to signal the fleet to commence Operation Torch. This is a real operation which took place. Another level sees you storming the beaches of Normandy. Again, this really happened. Now, there's probably a case where this isn't true, and I can guarantee if this is the case, someone will remind me in the comments, but I'm fine with that. The point is that the game does an impressive job of putting you into the boots of a soldier during this time period. Gameplay-wise, the game is mostly a typical first-person shooter. You receive objectives, you shoot people, you complete objectives, and the process repeats. Firstly, the good. Outside of the overall immersion, for the time period, the levels are huge. You can tell this game was really pushing the power of the PC, as opposed to the consoles of the time, owing to things like draw distance and detail. If you've played the PlayStation game, you'll know what I'm talking about. The game does a great job of pacing its objectives in a way that feels logical and engaging. No pressing random buttons here to complete an objective. You need to blow something up, you need to get the explosives, but you can't get the explosives without breaking into the explosive area, and so on. Pacing is so important in gaming because it gives you a reason to keep playing, and Allied Assault really nails this. Now, the next point is going to be subjective if it's a good or bad thing, and that's enemy AI. There's no easy way to put this. Even on the easiest difficulty setting, Allied Assault is a brutally difficult game. A machine gun wielding enemy can literally wipe most of your health off in a few seconds. Likewise, an enemy sniper can down you in just a few shots. These are some of the most accurate enemies I have ever seen in a video game, maybe ever. Now this would be okay if it were a level playing field, but it isn't. Enemies can lean around corners to shoot you, greatly reducing their hitbox while you cannot. They also seem to be able to hit you over ridiculously long distances with the same weapon area you are carrying, but with much greater accuracy. And to top this off, they often go prone at long range, making hitting them even more difficult. There's a mission halfway through the game which sees you storming the Normandy beach, and I died so many times. You literally start the level and are under immediate fire from multiple machine guns, which you can't take out, and instead you need to run between questionable cover to survive. Is it realistic for the actual conflict? Yes. Is it fun for a video game? Not for me. Now, I'm not saying this is all bad. A challenging game is not an inherently bad game at all, but it does feel like at times the AI is a little cheap. Now for the bad, and looking through my notes, the most highlighted challenge I had with the game is something I never thought I'd find myself complaining in a game about, but it's the flinch from being hit. So whenever you are hit with enemy fire, you flinch and lose the ability to return fire, which is fair enough. Even modern games like Warzone do this. But the level of flinch in Allied Assault, combined with some very cheap enemy placements, mean that you can literally round a corner into a machine gun enemy and be virtually movement stun locked by constant flinch. If they had toned this down about 50% of the implemented rate, I don't think it would have been an issue. But as it stands, it really proved a challenge for me. The other criticism I have lies with your allies, specifically the game's inability to clearly highlight or differentiate these from enemies. I lost track of how many of my squad mates I gunned down in cold blood by mistake, simply because they looked like the enemy. Likewise, in some missions that feature allies and enemies fighting each other, I had to really look to see who was who before positioning myself for the conflict. More often than not, getting it wrong. Now obviously none of these things are exactly game breaking, and both likely could be pretty easy to patch, but for where the game is at present, they do hold back an otherwise excellent adventure. As far as weapons go, you're getting a much more realism-focused roster and use of weapons as opposed to the more fantastical shooters. All of the weapons are modelled off real-world weapons from the era, and each have their own unique strengths and weaknesses, requiring you to really think about the best weapon class for any given scenario. Now I say class because as you progress through the game, you'll pick up both allied and enemy versions of these weapons. Take for example the submachine guns. In missions where you start from an allied base, you'll often start with the American-made M1A1 Thompson, whereas missions you start in the field, you might start, or even worse, you might need to find the German-made MP40. Each weapon does have a unique characteristic, for example rate of fire and clip size, but broadly speaking the weapon classes, or should I say the weapons within the classes, are all pretty balanced between both parties. First up you have the pistols, which is really only useful before you equip a more powerful weapon. They do a reasonable amount of damage for a video game adaptation of a pistol, but a small clip size makes them pretty much useless for any situation with more than one enemy. There is a silence pistol available, which is remarkably effective in some of the game's stealth areas, but it has an agonisingly slow fire rate owing to its manual rechambering. Next up are rifles, and these are available as both regular and scoped versions in most cases. No matter the version though, they handle exactly the same, optimised for picking off targets at range, the only difference being with the sniper versions, the Springfield and the scoped Kar98K, pretty much a one hit one kill, whereas the non-scoped versions require a few shots to down an enemy. Combine this with a relatively small magazine size, and the snipers are by far the more practical weapon, especially considering the almost hit-scan natures of your enemies at range, making lining up multiple shots a challenge. From rifles we come to the most used weapon class in the game for me, the submachine guns. These are by far the most versatile weapons in the game, able to deal with foes at both short to medium range, and even long range if you use short controlled bursts. Perhaps my only complaint is that the reload time for this class is painfully slow, making it easy for you to get overwhelmed in a large firefight without switching weapons. But apart from that, this class was my go-to, and it's definitely the best all-rounder as far as I'm concerned. Then comes actual machine guns. Now these are very fun to use owing to their immense stopping power, but the trade-off comes in both weight, which impacts your handling, as well as ammo being far more scarce than for the submachine guns. At range, outside of a sniper rifle, nothing can really compare with these, making them the logical choice in a lot of the large open area set pieces. Of course, you couldn't have a first-person shooter without grenades, and Allied Assault delivers both the Allied and German variety. I gotta say though that I didn't really find myself using grenades, save for a few times when enemies were all bunched together. The time required to switch from a firearm, throw a grenade, and then switch back to a firearm is pretty impractical, and you'd honestly just better using a submachine gun and mowing all your enemies down. The last main weapon category is the heavy weapons, which house the game's 2 launchers and oddly enough the shotgun. The launchers are primarily used for taking down tanks, mainly because aiming them is a real chore, and unless you're pointing it at something big and slow, chances are that you're going to miss your target. But there's definitely no chance of you missing your target with a shotgun. At close range, this thing is a one-shot kill, and super useful in close quarters combat. My only regret with the shotgun is you don't get to use it sooner in the campaign. Outside of the main weapon categories, there are some special weapons that you get to use through the game's roughly 8-hour campaign, ranging from machine gun nests to weapons mounted to a jeep, as well as an actual tank. There's also the ability to call in airstrikes, which while only used in some of the very specific set pieces of the game, was a lot of fun. My only real gripe with the weapons is the lack of melee attack on anything other than the pistol. So many times I would down an enemy by using the last round in my clip, and it would have been nice to have some melee ability to finish them off without reloading. But overall, Allied's assault weapons are interesting and satisfying to use. Now, while Allied Assault's levels and set pieces might not look like an oil painting by today's standards, they were very good for the time. While the levels are linear in design, they are expertly crafted with good level design and texture work to make you feel like you are navigating a war-torn environment. Much like the real-world conflict, there are both daytime and nighttime missions, which add variety to the campaign. There are also some pretty damn good weather effects, with the rain in one of the sniper-focused missions a standout in this category. All of these things add to the level's overall environmental storytelling, which combined with the level design, do a great job of player immersion. It's worth mentioning that there's also a lot of verticality in Allied Assault. Gone are the times of you existing on a single plane with the occasional enemy slightly higher or slightly lower than you. In Allied Assault, you'll find times where the enemy is flanking you from high above, necessitating careful planning to progress. However, the opposite of this is also true, with some segments putting you high above to rain down bullets on anyone who might challenge your position. Sound design, from the soundtrack to the voice acting and effects, are all top-notch. The soundtrack is actually composed by legendary composer Michael Giacchino, and it does a really brilliant job of selling the dramatic elements of the game. The voice acting is handled by an all-star cast, and you can tell that the voice actors actually had the context for the lines they were delivering and weren't just reading them off a script. This is a very good thing. Lastly, effects and ambience likewise turn in a great performance, with the D-Day landing a particular standout. You know, when I wasn't getting mowed down by the machine guns. While I could pick areas that I feel could be improved in gameplay and presentation, I don't think there's anything that could be improved in the sound design. It's just that good. Now, like I said in the start of this video, Medal of Honor isn't a perfect game. It has some issues when released, and in modern times, these issues have not aged that well. But regardless of these issues, Allied Assault was a catalyst for an era of games which benefited from the foundation that it laid, as well as educated a whole bunch of people on World War II history, myself included. Today there are 17 Medal of Honor games. Some are better than others, but there's no doubting that it's formed its own cult classic following. With no new games on the immediate horizon and publisher Electronic Arts leaning into its Battlefield franchise, it's hard to know if we've already seen the last of Medal of Honor. Regardless, many of the 17 titles are still playable today and give an excellent perspective on the World War shooting genre. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.